afternoon, and welcome to the Narrow Path radio broadcast. My name is Steve Gregg, and we are live for an hour each weekday afternoon. The reason we're live is so we can talk back and forth. Not just me talk to you, but you can talk to me. And the purpose of you talking to me during this hour would be that you could raise for consideration and discussion questions that you have or disagreements you have with the host. Questions in particular about the Bible, about Christianity. Any of those kinds of things are welcome here, and we have most of our lines filled, but I think we have a line open if you want to call this number. It's 844-484-5737. That's 844-484-5737, and there's no reason for us not to go directly to the lines now and talk to Jim calling in from Washington State. Hello, Jim. Welcome.
Thank you, Steve. I had two questions on two topics. The first one's out of 2 Kings 23, 21 and 22. Then the king commanded all the people, saying, "Keep the Passover to the Lord your God." And skipping down, such a Passover surely had never been held since the days of the judges who judged Israel, nor in the days of the kings of Israel. My question is, why had Israel not been celebrating the Passover, especially King David, and why didn't God say anything to them?
Yeah, I actually read that passage not very long ago, and I was wondering if it was saying that there had been, in fact, no Passover, celebration since the time of the judges, and it actually says there was no such Passover celebration since that time. And I think what it's saying is it was a big deal, a much bigger deal than it ever had been in those days. Now whether David or Solomon had celebrated the Passover I don't think is necessarily questioned here. And since David, of course, commonly said that he meditated day and night on the law of God, he certainly would not have been ignorant of it. Now, Josiah, who is the king in this case, had just discovered the law, and it had even been a totally foreign and unknown thing to Israel for apparently a generation or two at least, if not more. A priest found a copy of the law in the temple just while they're cleaning up, and he said, "What is this?" He didn't know what it was, and they're supposed to be the ones teaching the law to the people. The priest himself had never seen it before, and when Josiah had it read to him, it was totally new to him. So we can see how he might. Even if the Passover had been neglected entirely for some generations, why he would, try to get on the ball and do what they're supposed to do and have a celebration. And maybe he's trying to make up for lost time by having it so immense and so great. But there were a lot more sacrifices, a lot bigger hoopla for the Passover than had been done since the time of the judges or whatever. So, but it is probable that the Passover itself had not been celebrated for some time anyway. And that being so, that they would, have neglected it because they didn't know the law. But that wouldn't be the case in this case because they did know.
Okay.
It's just bigger, just a bigger one.
Okay. My second question is on 1 Chronicles 22, verses 7 and 8. It's when David's talking to Solomon. "My son, as for me, it was in my mind to build a house to the name of the Lord my God. But the word of the Lord came to me, saying, You have shed much blood and have made great wars. You shall not build a house for my name, because you have shed much blood on the earth in my sight." It was my understanding that God had approved about every battle that David had fought. So I was wondering if the blood he's talking about would be the blood of Uriah that David had murdered.
That is certainly a case of David wrongfully shedding blood, and that might come to mind that he's disqualified because he did that act of murder without any justification. That comes to mind. On the other hand, God had told him, "You have shed much blood, and this is why I don't have you build my house." And Uriah's blood wouldn't necessarily be a lot of blood. It sounds like it's because of David's military career in general. But it doesn't mean that God disapproved of his military career. but rather that David had not. It's like God has more than one thing he ordains for people to do. For example, the priests in the Old Testament did not go to war. The armies went to war, but the priests did not. They were serving a different function for the nation than warfare. And David his career had been much more like that, obviously, of the armies, not the priests. Apparently God wished for the priesthood to be more or less separated from the whole enterprise of war. Not that war is never justified or necessary, but that it's not the business of the priests, and it's not the things that God wants his temple and his worshipers. He wants to have their people whose hands are more or less clean from all of that kind of nasty political stuff, who are separated to the purpose of the temple. I suspect, just as the priests were not permitted to go to war because there were different functions for different people, that Solomon, who did not go to war, although he was not a priest, he could authorize and build the temple because he had not been in that other role. David had been in that other role justifiably. God was not against it. David is certainly God who helped him kill Goliath and who gave him victory over his enemies. But I think just because a military career is a different calling than a temple-based worship leading career. And so I think that God just felt like, okay, it's not that you did wrong. It's just that that's a different thing than I want really to have associated with my temple. So I've got, your son will not have to fight any wars, and so I'll have him build the temple. But it is true that David did kill at least once, unjustly, and that was, and it's amazing he wasn't even put to death for that. He received mercy for it. But I think that he said, since you've shed much blood, he's just referring to the general military career that David had had.
Great. Thank you so much.
All right, Jim. Great talking to you. God bless.
Thank you. Bye. God bless. Bye.
Okay, bye now. Ned from Idaho is next. Hi, Ned. Welcome.
Hey, Steve. I need your help on something. Me and my wife joined the church about 4 years ago, and in the bylaws and on the website it says non-denominational elder-led. Well, now after being there for a while, I realized that means no participation from the congregation, and sometimes I don't even think Jesus leads that place. Anyway, the pastor left a while ago, and we're trying to get a new pastor in, and we're having trouble. We interviewed a guy, and I knew he was going to have trouble because he would be on par with the elders, and the elders wouldn't be able to push him around like they did the previous pastor. Well, they sent him packing. And so a couple Sundays ago, one of the elders got up and said, well, we passed on this guy because he believes in old earth. And I said, right in front of everybody out loud, I said, that's a peccadillo. Well, then the next Sunday, which was just last Sunday, the big daddy elder got up. The big wise elder got up. He said, the reason is this is a big deal is because you have plants without sunlight and animals without death. I wrote this down. You have death before the fall. And the biggest thing was that it impacted atonement because it meant death was not a result of sin, but an aspect of creation. And so, and the other thing too is this potential pastor said, I have never preached on old earth. I don't have an axe to grind on old earth. And people could tell this guy was legitimate. He was a real, follower of Christ. But anyway, they sent him packing. So what I'm asking you is, how do I respond to those accusations that the elders said?
Well, I would say this. Okay, let's say a man's beliefs imply that there was plant life, that there was sunlight before plant life, and whereas in the Bible it says that there was plant life first. Okay, is that a moral issue? I mean, is that a thought that somehow makes him anything less than the best Christian in the church? I mean, how does this have a negative impact on him? It's a difference of opinion, but it's a difference of opinion on something that has absolutely no effect on spirituality or on morality or on intelligence. I mean, it just doesn't really, in any sense, measure up to something like a qualification or a deal breaker. Now, on the matter of sin before death, death before sin. For those of this audience who don't know that issue, the issue is as follows. Many people believe that the age of the earth is much greater than Christians have traditionally said, and that in that period of time there was a lot of living and dying. Animals were made a long time before people were. Animals, therefore, were clearly dying before people were, and even created. And the idea seems to be, therefore, because animals died before man sinned, that would teach that death is not the product of sin. Now, Christian theology says that the wages of sin is death, and that Adam's sin introduced death into the world and so forth. And therefore, since, if animals were dying before Adam was even made, then Adam's sin wasn't the cause of the death. And then they move forward, as you said, and say, therefore, there's no atonement, because if death is not the product of sin, then death is not the payment for sin, or whatever. I'm not sure how they said that, but here's the point. The only thing the Bible really teaches is that human death was a result of sin, and only humans are atoned for by the death of Christ. The Bible does not talk at all about death of animals as coming into the world through sin. We might believe that that was so, but the Bible doesn't say so. When it says, death entered the world through Adam, well, it's talking about human death. It's not talking about animal death. I mean, it may be that there were no animals that died before Adam, but that's not what Paul is discussing in Romans 5. And also in 1 Corinthians 15, he said that by one man, meaning Adam, death entered the world, and by one man, meaning Christ, resurrection from the dead came. Now, the animals are not going to be resurrected. Paul's not thinking about animal life and animal death. He's talking about human destinies, the state of humans in the sight of God and so forth. And humans died because of the sin of Adam, he says. And because of the righteousness of Christ, humans will be raised from the dead. This whole discussion leaves out of consideration anything about animals. And it would be entirely possible for animals to have died before man sinned if they were made mortal. And by the way, I'm not old Earth. I'm young Earth myself. But I'm saying it's an invalid criticism of the old Earth view to say, well, then animals died before sin came, and that contradicts Paul. No, it doesn't. Paul didn't say a thing or even have in mind any subject that was related to animal death. He's talking about human death. He's talking about human salvation and human condemnation. We were condemned because of sin and redeemed by the death of Jesus. That's a biblical doctrine, and nothing about that is compromised by the idea that animals lived and died. If that was true, I don't know that they did. I'm not saying they did. But if someone said, well, they did, I'd say, okay, I may not agree with that, but whether I do or not is inconsequential. There's no doctrine that is impacted by it negatively, at least no doctrine that has any consequence. So I think that the problem, the objection comes from a certain mentality that many Christians do have and have been basically encouraged to have. And that is, you need to have all the right opinions that fit in with the club, with our club. You know, our club take Genesis chapter 1 literally. Frankly, I'm in that club. Steve, I'm in that club. And that's fine. The club I'm in thinks Genesis 1 is literal. There are other clubs that believe Genesis 1 is not literal, and they have an older earth idea. Okay, a different club, but not a different religion, not a different body. There's one body, one spirit, one Father, and God. There's one of them. We all have that. A different opinion about something puts us in different opinion camps, but it doesn't put us in different bodies of Christ, and it doesn't in any way make us lesser people to have a wrong opinion on something like that. But I think the implications there drawn are coming from a misunderstanding of the implications of Paul's statements, because Paul is not saying there was no animal death or no plant death before Adam sinned. After all, the animals and Adam were eating plants, and there had been no sin. And even if there never was sin, they would be eating plants, and it would be no sin. So plants and animals dying is irrelevant to the question of the punishment for sin. Animals die because they're mortal beings. I believe man dies because he's a mortal being also, but had potential of living forever. If we hadn't sinned, we could have eaten of the tree of life and lived forever. But without eating of the tree of life, we die. And therefore, I think God made animals and man to be mortal. But the only reason sin has made us necessarily die is because sin cut us off from the tree of life, which if we had eaten of that, we wouldn't have to die. But sin cut us off from that, so we live out our mortal lives just like animals do. We were supposed to be different than animals. We were supposed to have access to the tree of life because of our relationship with God. We forfeited that. But I think their reasoning is wrong. I think their reasoning is misunderstanding something. I think in many respects they are probably repeating talking points that we of the young earth persuasion often use. I don't use that one, but young earth people often say that. And I think by saying that, they either believe that's got to be true, their statement, or else they're at least showing their loyalty to the camp that says those things. And it's too bad. But honestly, their view on that and the view of the guy that they dismissed doesn't, to my mind, speak poorly of either party. Anyway, Ned, I'm sorry that happened. It's too bad that churches divide over, as you say, peccadillos, very small matters. Doctrinal purity is often interpreted as sameness of opinion on all kinds of issues, and that is often used by denominations, especially, to exclude other people from being of pure doctrine, or at least as pure as theirs. Hey, I need to take another call, but God bless you. Glenn from New York, welcome to the Narrow Path.
Hey, good afternoon. How are you, Steve?
I'm well, thank you.
First-time caller. I've been listening to you for quite some time now. You've changed my life, and I thank you for that. I thank you for your ministry. My question is, yes, and still working on it. My question is, who wrote Genesis and when? I believe that Moses wrote it, but is there like a specific phrase in the Bible that says, yes, Moses was told how the earth was created and what happened on each day and things like that? And I also Googled it, and it mentioned like these 4 groups that talked about possibly writing Genesis as well. So
yeah, I can clarify that. Yeah, I can clarify that for you. I think the 2 main views among biblical scholars are what we call the traditional view, which I hold, and the critical view, which many modern scholars hold. The traditional view is in agreement with what the Jews believed, and these were their books, and they were written by their people. And the Jews always believed that Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Bible, called the Torah. Now, and conservative Christians always believe that too, partly because there was no reason to question it, and partly because there's biblical reasons to agree with it. Now, there are 5 books. Of the 5, 3 of them mention Moses writing parts of them, at least. In Leviticus and in, I believe, Exodus certainly, and Leviticus and Deuteronomy, all 3 of those books mention Moses as the author, at least of some parts of them, and presumably the whole books. That's 3 out of the 5. Now, there's not any reason to exclude the other 2, Genesis and Numbers, from that authorship, since there's nothing about them that tells us what their authorship was, but the 5 books were always considered to be, a unit of books given by Moses. The Jews always consider them the books of Moses. I will say this, that the difference between Genesis and the other books in that collection is that Genesis records stories that happened before Moses' time, whereas Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy all record the lifetime of Moses. He's born early in Exodus. He dies at the end of Deuteronomy. So it's the life of Moses in those 4 books. And we could easily see how Moses would be capable of writing them. He's a very literate man. He wrote laws and things like that, and there's no reason why he couldn't have written those. The question about Genesis then would be, okay, it's somewhat different than the others because it tells stories that occurred hundreds of years before Moses was born. How would he have information about that? How would he know the story in Genesis 1, for example? How would he know these stories? Well, I think what we see in Genesis is the frequent occurrence of a Hebrew word called toledoth. In the King James Version, this is usually translated generations. The meaning of the word toledoth means something like origins, or even the record of, or the history of. It's kind of a vague word that has those kinds of meanings. So in modern translations, the word toledoth is translated variously. In fact, even in the New King James, the word is translated a variety of ways, even in Genesis. But what we see is the word toledoth is usually associated with some person. The toledoth of Noah, the toledoth of Isaac, or whatever, the toledoth of, some other person. There's like 10 of them. There's like 10 of these toledoths. And each of them seems to be a punctuation mark in a group of chapters. And many scholars, conservative scholars, believe that these represent actually different documents. That maybe Adam wrote the first one. Who knows? We don't know who wrote the first one. But the others were probably written by, or at least about, the persons who are named as. The Toledoth of Ishmael would be either written by Ishmael or written about Ishmael by someone who knew him. And therefore, it would mean that Genesis was eventually put together from several documents that existed before Moses' time, written by the people themselves who are in them. So they'd be like eyewitness stories. And that Moses, when he became the leader of the nation, became the custodian of these writings that were the history of the Jewish people written by their ancestors. And therefore that Moses put them together into the book of Genesis. Now, if Moses didn't do that, somebody did. And since they were put together into the collection that, by the way, Genesis ends at the same point that Exodus begins, so it's not as if Genesis just stands out as a totally different work from the rest. It's like Genesis 1 begins and it goes straight through Deuteronomy. And so therefore, the Jews always believed Moses wrote it, and there's no reason to doubt it, frankly. Now, in addition to there being no reason to doubt it, although Genesis itself does not mention Moses, because he's not born at the time that those stories occurred, it doesn't say who the author is. But Jesus said to the Jews, "Did not Moses give you the Torah? And yet none of you keeps the Torah." Now, to the Jewish mind, the Torah is Genesis through Deuteronomy, all 5 books, including Genesis. And if Jesus was using the word Torah the way the Jews did, which it seems likely, then he said Moses gave you that. And that would be confirming the Jews' traditional views about the author of Genesis. Now, there's a possibility that when he said, "Did not Moses give you Torah," or the law, that he's not talking about the books of the law so much as the law itself, the law that was given at Mount Sinai. Moses was the instrument through whom it came. So he might just be saying that. Didn't Moses give you the laws and you don't keep them? But without any way of qualifying it, there's every reason to believe he meant the whole Torah, the whole 5 books. We can't be 100% sure, but that's the view that I think is most likely. Now, the other view is held by people who don't believe in Moses, liberal scholars who don't believe these stories are true, and they take the whole Pentateuch, the whole 5 books, and they say that they're really kind of a loosely and poorly put together collage of 4 different traditions from 4 different periods in Jews' history. Some, at one period, the Jews called God Elohim, so they call the portions written at that period, they think, as the Elohistic tradition. At one point, they say the Jews called God Yahweh, and the portions that use the word Yahweh, they say that's the Yahwist tradition. Then there's also what they call a priestly tradition, primarily found in Leviticus, and also a Deuteronomic tradition, which is mostly found in Deuteronomy. And they say these four traditions, before there was the written books of Moses, they circulated and sometimes conflicted with each other, but they were passed down orally until a time maybe as late as the Babylonian exile, long after the alleged time of Moses, and somebody wrote them down. Someone took these traditions and reduced them to writing, but they kind of in a confusing way mixed up elements of different traditions so that we can kind of discern where one begins, the other ends. This is all fabricated because it suggests that Moses didn't write any of it. And Jesus said Moses did. And frankly, Exodus, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy say Moses wrote them. So we have a choice. We can believe what the Bible itself says, including what Jesus said about it, or we can believe the modern scholars who don't know what they're talking about because they weren't there. They're just coming up with theories. In my mind, I go with the traditional view. I believe Moses wrote all 5 books, actually. I need to take a break, but I appreciate your call. We're going to take some more calls in the next half hour. The Narrow Path is listener-supported. If you'd like to help us stay on the air, you can write to The Narrow Path, P.O. Box 1730, Temecula, California, 92593, or go to our website, thenarrowpath.com. I'll be right back. We have another half hour to go.
As you know, the Narrow Path radio show is Bible radio that has nothing to sell you, but everything to give you. So do the right thing and share what you know with your family and friends. Tell them to tune in to the Narrow Path on this radio station, or go to thenarrowpath.com, where they will find topical audio teachings, blog articles, verse-by-verse teachings, and archives of all the radio shows. You know listener-supported Narrow Path with Steve Gregg. Share what you know.
Welcome back to the Narrow Path radio broadcast. My name is Steve Gregg, and we're live for another half hour taking your calls. If you have questions about the Bible or the Christian faith, you want to call in, ask those questions. We'll try to get to them, try to answer them. The number is 844-484-5737. That's 844-484-5737. Our next caller is Eddie, calling from Kentucky. Hi, Eddie. Welcome to the Narrow Path.
Howdy, Steve. Thank you for taking my call. Let me first apologize for my accent. I'm hillbilly as soup, beans, cornbread, and fried taters. But
I forgive you.
Oh, okay. A couple quick questions here, and I'll get off there and listen to your answers. Okay, I agree with 99.9% of the stuff that you say. That actually, I go to a church that don't agree with my philosophy. The thing that I have a problem with what you say is that Israel is not God's chosen people. Okay, I've got 2 verses here in the Old Testament. The first one will be 1 Samuel, chapter 12, verse 22. It says, "For the Lord will not forsake his people for his great name's sake, because it hath pleased the Lord to make you his people." Okay, now remember in the Bible when God was going to destroy the children of Israel, and Moses made intercession for the children of Israel to God, and God told Moses, said, "I'll make a mighty nation of you." And then that Noah told him, or Moses told him, said, "Well, if you kill all these people in the wilderness, then the heathen will say that because you was not able to fulfill your promise that you killed them in the wilderness." Okay, to my belief, God is a covenant God. Man seems to be that he can't keep promises, he won't keep covenant. Okay, my second verse would be 2 Samuel chapter 7, verse 10. He says, "Moreover, I will appoint a place for my people, Israel, and will plant them, that they dwell in the place of their own, and move no more, neither shall the children of wickedness afflict them any more as before time." Okay, now that just leads me to believe that, and I may be wrong, and you may be able to convince me otherwise, but the Bible leads me to believe that Israel is most definitely the chosen people of God. Okay, last time I called you, I called you young man, and it seemed like you took offense. But I know you're 72. your birthday was last week. I'm the 29th. Mine was the following day. On the 30th, I'm 57. I've got Bible to prove that. I meant no disrespect whatsoever.
I understand. I understand.
Okay,
I don't consider it disrespectful to disagree with somebody.
Okay.
I do want to know this, that when we say Israel's the chosen people, before I answer the rest of the question, what do we mean? Chosen for what? What were they chosen for?
Well, they was God's chosen people. He chose them out of all of the kindreds of the earth. And I realize that the blessing comes through Christ. I do realize that. But, it's stuck in my spirit that, Israel is the chosen people of God.
I got you, yeah. But what were they chosen for? Yeah, what were they chosen for? I mean, how are they different than other people who are not chosen? What's the distinctive?
Evidently, God saw them as a special people. That's, my understanding. I could be wrong.
Okay.
But,
well, I guess,
there was something about Abraham.
Let me answer if I could. And I do appreciate your question. Whenever people ask me if Israel's the chosen people, I just want to know, okay, if somebody's chosen, there's something they are chosen for, right? I mean, when I was in grammar school at recess, we'd choose up for softball teams, and I was the last person chosen because I was the last person worthy to be chosen. I was the worst. But when I was chosen, that meant I was chosen to participate in something. There's something I was chosen for. Anyone who's chosen by someone else, it's not just a word. You just don't point something that you're chosen. Well, what's that mean? Well, nothing in particular. You're just chosen. No, when God chooses somebody, he chooses them for something. Now, he chose Abraham, and he said, Abraham, I'm choosing you above all the others because through your seed, all the nations of the earth are going to be blessed. So through the seed of Abraham, he's going to bless all the nations of the earth. And that seed, the New Testament says the seed was Christ. So Abraham was chosen to give birth to a son who would give birth to another son, who would give birth to another son. And through a whole line from Abraham, his family was chosen to bring the Messiah who would bring blessing to all the earth. So, and Israel was, of course, in their time, Abram's seed, and they were the ones chosen to bring the Messiah into the world. And they did. Mission accomplished. Thank you, Israel. I appreciate that. They brought the Messiah into the world. Okay, then what they were chosen for was accomplished. If I'm chosen for a softball game, it doesn't mean that when the game's over, I keep playing. No, the game is over. I was there to participate in the game until it came to its end. What Israel was chosen for was to bring Jesus into the world. They did. Well, then what are they chosen for after that? No other assignments are mentioned. The Bible doesn't give any other assignment to them than that. So if we say they're still chosen, I think, well, if they're still chosen, what are they chosen for now? Nothing is ever said in the Bible about that. And frankly, no Christian ever gives me an answer to that either. I wish they would, because I'd like to know how they're thinking. But the truth is, when the Messiah came, Israel then had the great privilege of being the one nation to whom he came. And they could participate in his movement. They could become his disciples. They could bring the blessing of Abraham to all nations. Now, many of them did. We call them the disciples. And so the disciples now become the chosen ones to carry the blessing of Abraham to all the nations. And that is the gospel, of course. Now, the rest of Israel could participate too, but they didn't want to. I chose, sadly, I was married to a woman who I'm no longer married to, who left me many years ago. But I chose her as my wife, and I made promises to her I said, I will never leave you. I will never forsake you. I'll stay with you in sickness and health. I'm a faithful man. You can count on me here. And even when we had children, and sometimes the children would hear us arguing, I heard from James Dobson, you better make sure your kids know when you argue with your spouse that you're not going to break up. So I told my kids, your mom and I will never break up. We will always be together because we love each other and because God wants us together, and you don't ever have to fear that we're going to break up. This is my promise. Well, of course, I kept my promise. Unfortunately, the keeping of a promise like that requires the participation of more than one person. Sadly, my wife, their mother, didn't stay, and we're not married anymore. And so what I promised didn't come true. But of course, I could only be true to the part that's up to me. I couldn't be true to the part that was up to the other party. God promised Israel certain things. And he said, this is how he started it in Exodus chapter 19, verse 5, he says, if you will keep my covenant, that's like get married to me and stay married to me. If you'll keep my covenant and obey my voice, you will be a peculiar treasure to me above all the nations. That's a special people, more than any other nation. You'll be a kingdom to me of priests. You'll be a holy nation, he said. So this is the promise. This is the covenant. I'll be with you forever. I'll protect you forever. I'll give you this land forever. It's all for you forever. But of course, that's all part of the covenant. And in order for a covenant to continue, both parties have to continue, because it takes two parties to keep a covenant in force. It takes one party to break a covenant. And God said to Israel, if you keep my covenant, this is what it'll be with you and me forever. But they didn't. Honestly, they didn't. You don't have to read the Old Testament. See that? You don't even need the New Testament to tell you that. The Old Testament clearly says they broke the covenant. Even in Jeremiah, it says that God divorced them because of their repeated idolatries, which he considered like adultery. So there was no unconditional promise. In a covenant, both parties have to be participating. If one drops out and breaks it, it's not going to work. And all the promises God made to Israel, were conditional. Now, throughout Israel's history, some Jews did keep the covenant, and some still do, by the way. The promise is to those who keep the covenant. But the Jews who don't keep the covenant, they're not part of the covenant anymore. They don't want to be, and they're not. So as I see it, when Jesus came, it was now a new covenant they had to keep in order to keep the relationship with God, because the old covenant was fulfilled. The Messiah had come. Now it's time for the new covenant the Messiah would make. And he did make that covenant with Israel, that is, with the faithful remnant of Israel. There was always a faithful remnant in Israel, and all the Jews who were not part of it in Old Testament times, they died and went to hell just like any Gentile who died. There's nothing special about being a chosen person in terms of your eternal destiny if you're not obeying God. But the Jews who were obedient and faithful, God kept his promises to them. And then comes the Messiah, and of course the obligation now is to follow the Messiah. He's the king of the Jews, so Jews should follow their king. Some did, and they became the disciples of Jesus. Some did not, and they crucified Jesus. Now, just like the unfaithful Jews in the Old Testament, sometimes the earth even swallowed them up. In the case of Korah and his bunch, many Jews died in unbelief and were lost like any Gentiles were in the Old Testament. And that's true now too, because Jews and Gentiles are pretty much the same. They're all required to submit to Christ. The ones who do are the faithful. The ones who don't are the unfaithful. God's promises are to the faithful. He never made promises to the unfaithful. They're all, from the beginning, there were conditions. And, there are Jews who meet those conditions. We call them Messianic Jews, or really Christians. They're Christians of Jewish background. And there's also Gentiles who do. And Paul said there's no difference between Jews and Gentiles in Christ. So, the Israel, the Messianic Jews, to whom the promises still apply because they've been faithful to the covenant in Christ, God has still not rejected them. He's still chosen them to carry on the mission of Christ to the world, to bring the blessing of Abraham to all nations. But Gentiles are part of that too. There's no distinction. So to say, is Israel the chosen people or not? I'll say, well, first of all, the nation of Israel was chosen to bring the Messiah in the world, and they did. No other assignment was given to the whole nation, but to those who were the faithful remnant, they continued to be in covenant with God with a new covenant. And Jesus gave them the assignment. He says, as my Father has chosen me, I chose you, and I send you out, to be to win the world, to evangelize the world. So the mission goes on, and the faithful remnant of Israel are still God's chosen people. So I wouldn't say Israel's not God's chosen people. We'd have to say, which Israel do we mean here? The Israelites who are faithful, which is, all the Christians, Jews and Gentiles who are in one body, we're chosen people, to be sure. Israelites who are not believers really never have had any promises from God, even in the Old Testament. If they didn't keep his covenant, they were not part of his special people, he said. That was at the beginning, right after the Exodus, he said that. So it'd be kind of strange to say that the Jews who hate God, who are of the same spirit as those who crucified Christ and unrepentant about it, that somehow God has still chosen them for something or another. What? What in the world? Jesus called them the devil's people. He said they're their father, the devil. What has God chosen the devil's people to do? I don't know. I can't think of anything in the Bible that says they're chosen to do anything. And so God has always had promises and a mission for the faithful. And in the Old Testament, there was a faithful remnant. When Jesus came, thankfully, there was a faithful remnant. They became the disciples. That remnant grew to 3,000 on the day of Pentecost. It grew bigger and bigger. Finally, the Gentiles started being added to it. But then Gentiles were added to Israel in the Old Testament too. Ruth and Rahab, they were Gentiles. They became part of Israel. In the Old Testament, a Gentile could become part of Israel also by being faithful to the covenant. So it's just a different covenant. We have the new covenant now. And in Hebrews 8:13 it says, where there's a new covenant, the old is obsolete. So there's no old covenant left. The new one has replaced it, and it's obsolete. So faithfulness to God has nothing to do with being faithful to the old covenant. It has to do with being faithful to the new covenant, which is following Christ. And so those who do that, Jews and Gentiles, they're as much Israel as the Jews and Gentiles in the Old Testament who followed Christ. It's always one people, the faithful, that are the chosen. So I would not argue that Israel's not chosen. I would say that unbelieving Jews are not chosen for anything, just like they weren't chosen for anything in the Old Testament. Unbelieving Jews have always been lost, just like unbelieving Gentiles. And the Old Testament makes that very clear, by the way, and the New Testament equally. So I'm not going to say that the Jews or that Israel's not chosen. I think we have to identify what do you mean by Israel, because Paul said in Romans 9:6, they are not all Israel who are of Israel. In other words, there's two ways to talk about Israel. There's those who are of Israel, meaning the Jews, and then there's what God calls Israel. And not all the Jews are of that Israel. Well, who is that Israel? That's the Israel that follows Christ. That's the Israel that's faithful to the covenant. That's the faithful, those are the ones who are continuing on with the promises and the covenant of God. It's still Israel. And it's made up originally of, frankly, Jewish people only. Now, thankfully, Gentiles can be part of that too, but initially it was just Jews, the faithful remnant of Israel. And so, I mean, I think we may not disagree. We may agree or disagree, depending on whether you think unbelieving Jews are somehow still blessed by God, even though the Old Testament said they would not be. God said to the Jews, if you break my covenant, I'm going to disown you. I'm going to drive you out of the land. I'm going to take pleasure in destroying you just as I took pleasure in building you up. I mean, these are things that God said in the covenant. So if he's a covenant-keeping God, then he's going to have to reject those that he said he would reject, the ones who break his covenant. And, but fortunately, any Jew in the world can become a faithful follower of Christ too. Many hundreds of thousands have, and frankly, every last Jew is free to do so. So it's not like God has closed the door to the Jews. He still holds out the opportunity for them to be faithful, just like he did in the Old Testament. And so it's a different way of looking at it, but it's the way that I think the Bible looks at it. But a lot of people have a different view, and if you do, that's fine. I don't hold it, there doesn't have to be any conflict between you and me. I appreciate your call, brother. Let's talk to Howard in Idaho. Howard, welcome. Howard, are you there? Oh,
yeah,
I'm sorry.
Can you hear me?
Button.
I'm getting pretty poor
I
reception.
can now. I'm sorry. Yeah, I
Okay.
pushed your button, but it didn't activate your call. Go ahead.
Okay, great. I'm just curious. I had heard that pre-World War I, there were a lot of Jews buying up a lot of the property in Israel. Have you heard anything along that line? Just kind of relating to the idea
That's correct.
of would the Jews return and so on.
Right, that is correct. I think, if I'm not mistaken, I know I have the statistic written down somewhere. I don't have it memorized, but I think something like 6% of the land in Palestine was owned by Jews who had purchased it before Israel was declared a nation. So they had bought some of it, and it was partly theirs. Not politically. Okay, because that's just like if I buy land in Germany, that doesn't give me that doesn't give me some rulership in Germany over that piece of land. You can buy land in foreign countries. It didn't belong to Israel, but Jews bought it from the people who it did belong to.
Yeah, I had heard like 70% or something like that. But okay, thanks very much.
It may have gotten that high. Sure, thank you for your call. It may have gotten that high, but as I recall, quite late in the 20th century, there was still, I think, only 6% of the land was owned by Jews who had purchased it. I'm not going to swear by that statistic, but I've read it, and I mean, I quote it in my lectures. I just don't remember right now. My lecture series called "What Are We to Make of Israel?" goes into all of that, especially the two lectures in that series called "The Modern State of Israel." I'll give you the history of how that came about in my series at thenarrowpath.com under topical lectures. A series called "What Are We to Make of Israel?" Those interested in that subject might find that lecture series helpful, I would hope. Harold from Brooklyn, New York, welcome.
Hello, Steve. How are you?
I'm fine, thanks.
All right. I've been listening, and I heard first, before I ask my question, Romans 3:2. Much in every way, because firstly, indeed, that they were entrusted with the words of Elohim, the chosen, set apart, and priests. They were entrusted with the words of Yahovah, which we now have. That is what they are chosen for, to be priests and set apart. Now, you just told everybody, I don't know what. But, all right,
okay, what I told everybody is this, that God chose them to bring the Messiah into the world. One of the benefits he gave them as people possessing that mission was he gave them the oracles of God. That is, of course, the law and the prophets. And that's what Paul says in Romans 3:1. He says, what advantage then has the Jew? Have the Jews had advantages? A bunch. But the most important, he says, is that God gave them his word, his oracles. Now, he said he gave them great advantages, but in verse 9 he says, what then? Are we better than they? Meaning, are we Jews better than the Gentiles? He says, no, not at all. I mean, we had more advantages, but we didn't turn out any better. That's what Paul's arguing there. But anyway, that's another matter. Go ahead and share with me what your question is, because we are running out of time.
All right. By no means am I saying anything about them being better, just that they are the chosen. And they are chosen because of their fathers, not because
of wait. Let me stop you. I want to ask you.
Now,
okay, I want to ask you the same question I asked the previous caller. He believes they're chosen too. You told me why they are chosen, because they're fathers. But what are they chosen for? Can you tell me what they're chosen to do or for?
We are chosen. They are chosen. They are chosen, as it says in Exodus, to be priests, as it says in Exodus chapter 9, verse 5. Or is it 4? To be
kingdom of priests.
Especially says, if you obey my voice.
Right. That's right. And so they were chosen 1,400 years before Christ to be a kingdom of priests on the condition, as you mentioned, if you obey my voice and keep my covenant. Of course, they didn't. But there is still a kingdom of priests. We read of it in Revelation chapter 5, that there's a great company singing out, you have redeemed men from every kingdom and nation and tribe and made them kings, a kingdom of priests unto God. So in Israel, out of Egypt, it was the Israelites who were the kingdom of priests, but since they didn't keep the covenant, it says in Revelation that God has redeemed people out of every nation and made them the kingdom of priests. So Peter says, of course, in 2 Peter, writing to Christians, and in verses 9 and 10, he says, you are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation. These are the things that God promised to Israel in Exodus 19, excuse me. And But now he says we Christians are those things. So there's nothing in the New Testament that would suggest that some ethnic group are now priests. Actually, the priesthood of the Old Testament isn't even functioning anymore. Instead, there's a priesthood of Christ, of the order of Melchizedek. So anyway, did you have a question for me?
Yes, I do. But first, Psalms 89:34.
Excuse me. I'm sorry. Not first. I wanted your question because you know what? I only have 6 minutes left. I don't need a lot of more quotes. I don't mind quotes, but you said you had a question, and it seems like you want to preach instead. Listen, feel free to call sometime when we have more time. If you have a succinct way to make the point you want to make, I'd love to hear it. But I want to give as many people a chance before we're out of time here to ask their questions. Joseph from Denver, Colorado. Welcome.
Hey, Steve. Thanks for taking my call. Can you hear me fine?
Yes, please proceed.
All right, Steve, in Revelation 12:17, it lays the blueprint down on the group of people or church that Satan is going to attack in the end times. How would you articulate that verse, Revelation 12:17?
How would I explain it?
KJV. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it says that they are the other children, the other seed of the woman who bore Christ. And it says they are the ones who have the testimony of Jesus and keep the commandments of God. So this would, of course, be the church. The church are the ones who have the testimony of Jesus and keep the commandments of God. That's how I interpret it.
So are we still supposed to keep the commandments then, or not?
Well, the commandments of God are those that Christ gave us. God gave Israel a certain kind of commandments when they were under a covenant that involved 613 laws that he gave them. That covenant's no longer present. There's a new covenant, and it makes the old one obsolete, the Bible says. So the new covenant is Jesus is our Lord, and whatever he commands, we do. So obviously the commandments of God are those that are given through Jesus, not the ones that were given through Moses under a different covenant era. Jesus said, go and make disciples of all men, teaching them to observe all things that I have commanded you. Not what Moses commanded. Jesus gave commands to his disciples, and those are the things that Christians are obliged to keep. And those are, because Christ is God and the Messiah, those are the commandments of God. So our obligation then is to obey Jesus because he's the king. That's what you do when you have a king.
Okay, so the new covenant isn't God's law written in our heart.
It is. It is. But God's law is a law of a new covenant, not the law of the old covenant. God does something different in the new covenant than he did in the old. He doesn't just give us external commands. He writes them in our hearts. But it is a different covenant, and different covenants have different stipulations. That's because if that weren't so, then you and I would be absolutely obligated to make 3 trips to Jerusalem every year and offer animal sacrifices in the temple, because that's repeated many times in the law. If we're supposed to keep that law,
you don't differentiate the. Sorry, not to cut you off. You don't differentiate the commandments from the entire law. I see you're combining them all together.
Right.
You don't differentiate the commandments, the 10 commandments. You don't differentiate those from the entire law. Okay.
No, not at all. Not at all. Because if you actually get a concordance out and look in the Old Testament, look up the word commandments or commandments, singular, either one. Look them all up. You'll find that it is not a term that refers to the 10 commandments only. All kinds of things related to animal sacrifices are called commandments too. It's entirely arbitrary to say we have to keep the commandments of God, but that only means the 10. I would say, why? Why only the 10? Does that mean it's okay to be homosexuals or to kidnap or practice witchcraft? That's not in the 10. It's forbidden. But the thing is, the commandments of God are numerous, and they're not just 10. So anyone who would limit it to the 10 commandments is simply being arbitrary. But we keep the commandments of Christ because we're his followers. We're not Moses' disciples. We're Christ's disciples. We're out of time. You're listening to The Narrow Path. Our website is thenarrowpath.com. Thanks for joining us. Have a wonderful day.